There was a time not long ago when I found myself caught in the thick of a storm that no one else seemed to see. Not because it wasn't raging, but because it was built quietly, invisibly, inside my mind. A storm of thoughts, swirling relentlessly, where calm moments seemed like distant islands that I could barely reach. Each morning, I woke feeling like I was walking a tightrope stretched precariously over uncertainty, tension knotting my chest, and the relentless hum of worry at the edge of everything I tried to do. It wasn't that I faced a sudden crisis or an obvious trigger. Instead, my anxiety threaded itself into the fabric of my daily life in whispers, subtle enough to hide, but powerful enough to shape every moment. At first, I told myself I was just overthinking, something everyone did now and then. But overthinking grew into a shadow that clung to me, a repetitive cycle I barely noticed until I felt trapped beneath it. It was like a looping track of invisible footsteps echoing in my mind, steps I didn't realize I was taking until I was exhausted from the journey. I began to recognize that this wasn't random. Inside me, patterns were growing, mental habits that rooted themselves deeply, feeding the anxious voice that kept whispering, "What if?" or "not enough," with relentless certainty. It was maddening, because on the surface, I seemed to function perfectly fine, even composed. But under the polished exterior was a mind running ragged, habitually falling into ways of thinking that made calm impossible. What struck me most was how natural these habits felt. They didn't appear as glaring warnings or alarms, but as small nudges, thoughts so familiar I'd mistaken them for truth or simple curiosity. Am I forgetting something important? Did I say the right thing? What if this all falls apart? The questions weren't the problem. It was the way they multiplied in endless loops, spinning a web that held me captive. I began to realize that anxiety doesn't materialize out of nowhere like a sudden storm, but grows quietly in fertile ground made of repetitive mental patterns I barely noticed, much less controlled. The more I peeled back the layers, the clearer it became that my greatest challenge wasn't the anxiety itself, but these unseen habits, the default settings of my mind, setting a stage where anxious feelings thrived. There was a strange kind of blindness to these habits, because they weren't loud or dramatic. They worked behind the scenes, like a script quietly running in the shadows of every decision, every thought, every breath. Understanding this was both freeing and terrifying. If these patterns were the roots, then maybe, just maybe, changing what grows in this soil could transform everything. But starting was daunting. How do you uproot habits that are almost invisible, woven so deeply into how you experience the world? I remember sitting alone one night, heart racing despite no clear reason, feeling overwhelmed with exhaustion and desperation. I needed to figure out why my mind was a battlefield and how I could find peace in the chaos. I knew I wasn't alone in this struggle. So many of us carry these quiet mental weights, trying to appear calm on the surface while fighting invisible battles beneath. The realization hit me hard. These mental habits weren't just frustrating quirks. They were real forces shaping how deeply anxiety touched every part of our lives. If I could bring awareness to these patterns, the ones we don't usually see or name, I could start reclaiming control step by step. That night, I made a silent promise to myself. I wouldn't let these unseen voices dictate my days anymore. I would learn to recognize the ways my mind trapped me, to uncover the subtle traps hidden in everyday thoughts, and to find methods that could help calm the storm at its source, not just silence its noise temporarily. It felt like stepping into unknown territory, no blueprint, no easy answers. But something inside me stirred, a quiet courage, a willingness to meet my own mind with curiosity and kindness rather than judgment or fear. This is why I want to share this journey with you. Because if you're listening now, chances are you've felt that weight too. The restless thoughts that don't seem to end, the constant pull of anxiety that grows in places you didn't even realize were fertile ground for worry. And if you're ready to look closely at the invisible mental habits fueling that fire, to shine light on what's happening inside, we can walk this path side by side. There's a way forward, one where awareness meets action, where understanding leads to change, and where the oppressive heaviness of anxious thinking can give way to calm focus. Together, we'll explore the subtle yet powerful patterns that keep anxiety alive, and you'll discover practical ways to shift your mind toward responses that soothe your nervous system rather than feeding the storm. This is about you stepping into the role of the protagonist in your story, the one who recognizes the hidden saboteurs and chooses to rewrite the narrative with intention and care. It's not a quick fix or a magic spell. It's a journey of conscious change, of small choices made with awareness that can transform how you experience each day. So if you've ever wondered why anxiety sometimes feels like it's building momentum from nowhere, or why your thoughts seem to trap you in loops you can't break free from, you already know the struggle. Now, you're invited to see it with new eyes, to uncover the mental patterns beneath, and to begin the process of healing and strength. The first step is simply to notice, to acknowledge that something hidden is influencing your experience. From there, the path opens. I hope you'll join me as we explore these quiet saboteurs and the ways to gently but firmly shift away from them. Because peace of mind isn't just a distant dream, it's a place we can all start moving toward, one mindful thought at a time. There was a moment when I realized my mind resembled a wild garden, not in full bloom, but overwhelmed by creeping vines of restless thoughts that strangled any sense of ease. It wasn't just a fleeting mood. It was like invisible weeds pushing through the cracks of my consciousness, spreading in places I hadn't explored before. I remember sitting by the window that evening, watching shadows stretch and blend, my internal landscape mirroring the fading light. My thoughts were no longer simply passing clouds. They had thickened into a heavy fog, making it hard to see clearly or breathe freely. One evening, my friend Amanda called me out of the blue. Her voice was lively but carried a subtle tension I hadn't noticed before. "I've been feeling like my brain won't switch off," she admitted, "like this unspoken soundtrack looping in the background that I can't stop." Her words echoed my own silent battles. She talked about a cycle of overanalyzing little things: emails, conversations, decisions, each thread reinforcing that buzzing undercurrent of unease. Listening to her, it dawned on me that this experience wasn't isolated or abnormal. It was something shared, though rarely discussed so honestly. Amanda's description helped me realize that the trouble didn't come merely from the thoughts themselves, but from how my mind's spotlight was trained. Instead of pausing or shifting focus, it relentlessly zoomed in on uncertainties and what-ifs, as if drawn to a magnetized source of distress. The longer the gaze lingered, the stronger the emotional pull, an exhausting feedback loop that twisted calm into chaos. I imagined it like being trapped in a hall of mirrors, each reflection distorting reality and doubling my unease. One night, intrigued by Amanda's insight, I decided to experiment with my attention. Instead of letting my awareness dart instinctively toward worries, I consciously tried to direct it toward sensations I hadn't given space to before: the soft rhythm of my breath, the subtle temperature of the air resting against my skin, the distant hum of night sounds outside. It was strangely grounding, like dipping a toe into a cool stream after being parched in the sun. I noticed a flicker of resistance, a whisper saying, "This won't work," yet I persisted. Within moments, that familiar tightening eased, just enough to feel a crack in the fortress of tension. As I explored further, I uncovered a vital truth: what my consciousness dwells on becomes the foundation for emotional states. When I lingered excessively on doubts or imagined crises, I unwittingly nourished the anxieties that held me hostage. Conversely, when I shifted focus intentionally to concrete, present-moment experiences, the knots loosened. It was as if my attention had the power to cultivate either thorns or blossoms within my inner landscape. A few weeks later, I found myself trapped in a high-stakes meeting at work, the kind where every word felt like a potential landmine. Typically, my mind would spiral, replaying possible missteps or anticipating judgment. But this time, I consciously anchored myself in simple tactile awareness, placing both feet flat on the floor, feeling the weight of my body in the chair, subtly grounding my scattered thoughts. Instead of tumbling into mental chaos, I noticed my breathing slowly steady. The meeting passed with far less inner turmoil than usual, and I felt surprised by the quiet clarity that had emerged amidst the pressure. These small victories nudged me to understand something essential about my inner workings. The default pathway my mind followed was often automatic, fueled by habitual focus on apprehensive thinking that felt normal but was downright wearing me down. Changing this required cultivating a new skill, a conscious embrace of attention's power to reorient me toward experiences that soothe rather than agitate. The challenge was that this skill called for daily practice, like nurturing a delicate seedling that needed consistent care to grow strong. To deepen this transformation, I began experimenting with labeling my moment-to-moment awareness. When thoughts or worries arose, I'd quietly name them. Here is fear, or here is doubt. This brief act created distance, revealing these sensations as passing guests rather than permanent residents. Suddenly, the overwhelming storm seemed more like scattered raindrops, natural, transient, manageable. This simple approach cracked open a door to self-compassion, replacing judgment with gentle curiosity. In the midst of this process, I realized that the relentless mental noise wasn't an enemy to defeat, but a signal inviting me to become more present and intentional. Standing in this new awareness, I felt less like a victim caught in automatic loops, and more like a participant at the helm of a ship, steering through choppy waters with skill. Although the currents didn't vanish overnight, the ability to guide my focus became a lighthouse, steady and reliable. Now, reflecting on those early days, I see the crucial difference lies not in erasing anxious thoughts, but in mastering the art of mental direction. When we train our focus toward calming, affirming experiences, even the tiniest ones, we create an internal sanctuary that begins to rewrite the very operations of our nervous system. This is the hidden power in how we engage with our own minds. It shapes the emotional climates where anxiety either thrives or dissolves. So I invite you to imagine your mind as an expansive terrain, one that can be cultivated with either neglect or mindful attention. What if, by simply recognizing where your gaze naturally falls and gently shifting it, you could open pathways away from overwhelm? What small, intentional focus could you embrace now that would bring even a flicker of ease? Together, these mindful choices can rewrite the story written in the hidden corners of your awareness, moving from patterns of unrest toward rhythms of peace. This journey isn't about perfect control, but about rediscovering the influence you hold over your inner world, step by deliberate step. Sometimes, I find myself stepping into moments that feel like walking through a house full of flickering shadows, each corner revealing reflections of worries I didn't know I carried. One afternoon, during a hectic day, I noticed an alarming tightness gripping my chest, invisible to everyone around me. Instead of succumbing to panic, I decided to sit quietly by the window, watching an old oak tree's branches sway gently with the breeze. The contrast was striking. While my thoughts churned relentlessly, nature moved with effortless grace. This forced pause sparked a revelation about how my brain often clings fiercely to imagined outcomes, as if those projections hold the key to safety, even though they drain my energy endlessly. In that stillness, I began to realize that what truly escalates my anxiety is not just excessive thinking, but the way my mind treats uncertainty like a monster hiding under the bed, a menace to be hunted down, analyzed, and conquered immediately. The compulsion to solve every what if fuels a restless urgency that paralyzes any sense of ease. Instead of accepting unpredictability as an intrinsic part of life, I wage war against it internally. This relentless battle paradoxically crafts more distress, not less. I realize that discovering inner equilibrium demands a shift in how I relate to the unknown, a welcoming rather than a rejection. As days went on, I experimented by telling myself aloud during moments of rising tension, it's okay to not know, and uncertainty doesn't have to mean disaster. Initially met with resistance, these affirmations planted tiny seeds of relaxation inside me. I imagined anxiety as water swirling in a glass. If I stirred it vigorously, it grew murky and unsettled. If I allowed it to settle without forceful effort, clarity eventually emerged. This metaphor became my compass, guiding me to pause the agitation of thought and wait patiently for clarity's return. One evening, I shared these insights with Marcus, a close friend grappling with similar restlessness. He confessed that his mind performs like a race car engine stuck in overdrive, constantly revving without release. We talked about how modern life teaches us to reject discomfort outright, craving control and immediate answers. But in chasing this control, we feed the very tension we want to escape. Together, We wondered how adopting a mindset of curiosity about our anxious feelings, observing without immediate judgment, might open space for genuine calmness to arise. This conversation expanded my view. Anxiety is less a problem to eradicate and more an experience to engage with differently. The following weekend, I decided to test this idea during a routine hike. As I climbed with deliberate slowness, I kept turning my attention toward my body's sensations, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot, the warm sunlight filtering through the canopy, the subtle rhythm of my heartbeat. Each moment of embodied awareness acted as a tether, preventing my mind from drifting into exhaustion-inducing what-ifs. When anxious thoughts appeared, I no longer felt compelled to chase them or push them away. Instead, I welcomed them as signals pointing to vulnerable spaces within. I approached these with gentle recognition, like encounters with old friends whose visits I couldn't avoid but might greet with better grace. This shift cultivated a profound sense of agency. Anxiety's voice remained, but it lost its commanding timbre and took on a quieter tone. It no longer dictated my behavior or hijacked my energy. I realized that learning to sit alongside discomfort, to listen without immediate reaction, was a powerful tool, less like fighting an enemy and more like tending a fragile garden after harsh weather. It required patience, compassion, and endurance. My experience also showed me how the frantic urge to fix every uneasy thought reinforces anxiety's strength. In my attempts to silence distress, I often roused deeper layers of tension. By contrast, relinquishing the demand for instant resolution brought surprising relief. This slowing down fostered mental freedom, permitting space for insight and healing to emerge naturally. I liken this to the difference between grasping at a slipping rope and loosening one's grip to reposition safely. The latter approach, though less instinctive, proved far more sustainable. When I returned home from that hike, I journaled about these revelations, expressing gratitude for moments when I allowed myself to be tender rather than tough. Writing deepened my understanding that transformation isn't linear. Setbacks don't signal failure, but opportunities to practice renewed kindness toward myself. This inner dialogue shifted the relationship with anxious feelings from adversarial to cooperative, establishing a foundation for ongoing growth. As you reflect on your own encounters with unease, consider stepping into this perspective of acceptance without resignation. Notice how tension acts not just as a signal of danger, but an invitation to explore your inner landscape with openness. What if leaning into discomfort with curiosity, instead of retreating or resisting, creates avenues for unexpected resilience and peace? Powerful change often begins where effort relaxes and listening deepens. If anxiety often feels like an invisible current pulling you off balance, imagine learning to ride its waves with conscious presence rather than battling them blindly. This invites a profound reorientation, from exhausting struggle to skillful engagement. It's not a quick remedy, but a lifelong partnership with your mind's complexities. Embracing this idea transforms how you move through each day, lighting a path through uncertainty toward an anchored sense of calm that you carry within. One afternoon, while sitting alone in a bustling cafe, I became acutely aware of how my mind darted incessantly from one worry to the next, like a restless hummingbird sampling random flowers in a manic frenzy. I tried to focus on the aroma of freshly ground coffee, but my thoughts insisted on pulling me back into their looping circuit. Suddenly, a phrase whispered by an old mentor floated back to me. The mind craves repetition more than novelty, and therein lies its trap. That moment sparked a new awareness. I began to suspect that simply noticing my racing thoughts wasn't enough. I had to uncover the underlying mechanisms that drove those compulsions to repeat certain patterns. Later that day, I mulled over how countless tiny triggers acted like hidden drumbeats, silently urging my brain to replay a particular melody of worry. It was clear that the issue wasn't just the presence of nervous energy, but these invisible cues that kept pulling me into cycles I didn't actively choose. For example, a passing comment from a coworker, an email left unanswered longer than usual, or a social post I half remembered. Each became a spark flaring the pathways of unease deeper into habit. My thinking operated like a finely tuned machine, conditioned by these repeated experiences to fire the same alarms over and over. I started to realize that interrupting this loop required more than surface-level awareness. What if I could track these cue action sequences carefully and rewrite their impact? This curiosity led me to keep a small notebook, discreetly jotting down moments when anxiety crept up. I recorded what I was doing, who I was with, and what internal dialogue sounded in my head. Almost immediately, patterns emerged, certain environments, moods, or types of self-talk that acted as secret accelerants to tension I had never consciously registered before. One particular afternoon stands out. I was in a meeting when suddenly a familiar tightening stole my breath. My heart rate prioritized panic over calm. Without warning, a mental script played on repeat. You're making a mistake. Everyone's judging you. But then, catching the beginning of that loop, I forced myself to whisper internally, this is a reaction, not reality. It felt as if I'd disrupted a pre-recorded track mid-song, halting automaticity just enough to step outside my racing mind. That brief break allowed me to breathe more fully, and the fog of worry shifted just enough to allow actual clarity to seep in. From there, I experimented further, noticing how tiny gestures could powerfully redirect my internal landscape. Crossing my arms tightly, for instance, tended to reinforce defensiveness and escalate discomfort. But simply releasing that tension and adopting an open posture resembled a signal to my nervous system that danger was less imminent. These discoveries drove home something vital. The patterns anchoring tension didn't originate solely within cognition. They were intimately linked with physical states and behaviors, sometimes reinforcing each other in a vicious feedback loop. Another breakthrough came when a close friend suggested trying movement breaks during bouts of nervous restlessness. At first skeptical, I gave it a shot. During a particularly stressful day, I paused to stretch, breathing deeply as I did. To my surprise, the swirling chaos inside shifted noticeably. It was as if these intentional interruptions granted my body permission to reset its internal alarm system. That simple physical cue generated a ripple effect, a subtle relaxation of muscles followed by a softening of my mental grip on worry. Soon, I understood that reprogramming my responses involved layering several strategies: attentive tracking of cues, intentional pauses, mindful adjustments of posture, and gentle physical movement. Together, these created a dynamic toolkit, dismantling the entrenched grooves anxiety had carved into my day. This process felt less like battling an invincible foe and more like learning to conduct an orchestra gracefully instead of letting instruments play out of tune. Now, consider how this applies when you face rapid spirals of stress. Could a small, conscious gesture, a breath, a stretch, a mental note, be the pebble that redirects the stream of your mind? When you become fluent in detecting subtle precursors to distress, you reclaim choice within seconds that moments before felt dominated by compulsive reactivity. Each interruption of the default mental track builds confidence and capacity to handle future waves, creating momentum toward greater ease. One evening, reflecting on this growing awareness, I imagined my mind as a vast theater where countless rehearsals of anxious scripts occurred backstage without invitation. Those rehearsals lacked direction but wielded power to control the entire show. My goal became the role of quiet director, patiently inviting new scenes and improvisations, one small act at a time, crafting a performance where calm, focus, and resilience claimed their rightful place center stage. In embracing this challenge, I discovered a practical path through what once felt like endless labyrinths of worry, where subtle shifts in attention and action became bridges toward lasting transformation. I remember a particular morning when the usual whirlwind of thoughts morphed into an almost tangible fog, suffocating yet unseen. Instead of resisting the storm pounding inside me, I decided to sit still, letting curiosity replace frustration. As I closed my eyes, vivid images began to form, not memories, but fragmented snapshots of repeated mental patterns. Moments when my attention obsessively tunneled into hypothetical disasters or amplified self-criticism. These flashes revealed something deeper. I wasn't just trapped by what I thought, but by how reflexively my awareness spiraled into these ruts without pause or intervention. It felt as though my consciousness ran on an autopilot circuit, firing old tapes with unwavering familiarity. I felt like a prisoner serving a sentence drafted long before I fully understood the charges. On that day, I met with Mara, a wise therapist who had helped me untangle complex emotional knots before. Let's explore the voice behind your racing thoughts, she suggested gently. Not just the content, but the way it interacts with your awareness. Her invitation sparked an entirely new exploration. I began to investigate this internal narrator, noticing how it often spoke in tones tinged with urgency or dread, unconsciously commanding my focus to compliance. This voice functioned almost like a drill sergeant, perpetually scanning for threats and discarding moments of peace as distractions. As I listened more closely, I identified a repeated mantra echoing beneath the chatter. You must anticipate, or you'll be unprepared. This mantra, I suspected, fueled relentless anticipation and guarding, a mental loop masquerading as protection. One afternoon, during a reflective walk in the park, I experimented with a different approach. Instead of engaging with that internal voice, I imagined it as a character on a stage, performing lines written long ago. Observing it from this angle, I noticed how much energy I had been giving to a script that no longer served my well-being. The realization hit me like an unexpected wave. This voice was not an omniscient authority, but a habitual actor repeating memorized dialogue. With a mixture of relief and astonishment, I found the courage to gently interrupt the play. I softly told myself, I hear you, but I don't need to follow your cue this time. Immediately, a sliver of quietness emerged, a pause in the ceaseless chatter where possibility breathed. Another layer unraveled when I became aware of how tightly I clung to certainty, craving definitive answers where uncertainty prevailed. I noticed that in moments when life's questions remained unanswered, my awareness sharpened into a fierce spotlight, magnifying every imagined flaw or failure. Paradoxically, this intense scrutiny served only to deepen my unease. To counter this, I consciously invited a spirit of inquiry rather than judgment, a willingness to hold space for ambiguity as part of the human experience. I practiced narrating my internal experience aloud. Right now, I don't know what will happen, and that's okay. This simple shift transformed the atmosphere inside, softening it from stifling rigidity into something more breathable and expansive. During a quiet evening at home, I found myself engaged in a conversation with my partner about how difficult it can be to relinquish control. Sometimes, I feel like if I don't anticipate every possibility, chaos will sneak up and take me unprepared, I confessed. He replied with unexpected wisdom. But what if your attempts to control are the very bricks building that prison around you? His words struck a chord that reverberated deep within. I began to notice that my mental patterns operated like an invisible cage, forged from relentless attempts to guard against imagined collapse, yet ironically limiting my ability to respond freely and calmly. This insight sowed a seed of compassion toward the parts of me desperately seeking safety, even if their methods were counterproductive. In the days that followed, I embraced a new exercise. Each time the mental chorus swelled, I invited my awareness to shift toward the physical sensations tethered to those thoughts. Rather than getting swept up by mental loops, I tuned into the warmth of sunlight on my skin, the grounded weight of my feet against the floor, or the rhythm of my breath. These anchors served as calming waypoints, each acting as a tether pulling me away from the storm and toward steadiness. Over time, these repeated actions rewired my habitual responses, allowing me to greet stressful cues with increasing equanimity instead of escalating tension. One chilly morning, while sipping tea by a foggy window, I reflected on this journey so far. I acknowledged that unraveling these entrenched routines requires patience and perseverance. The breakthrough isn't a sudden epiphany, but a series of conscious invitations to observe, to question, to redirect inner attention with kindness and determination. What feels like chaos can become an unwoven tapestry, thread by thread reassembled into a textured, resilient whole. In embracing this process with openness and courage, I discovered a nascent freedom nestled within, waiting patiently beneath the layers of habitual unrest. The first time I noticed how deeply embedded my restless thoughts had become was during a late-night walk through a quiet neighborhood. The streets were empty, the only illumination coming from flickering streetlights casting shadows that stretched in unfamiliar shapes. I found myself caught in an unrelenting loop of what-ifs. But this time, instead of falling prey to the familiar anxiety spiral, something shifted inside me. My awareness sharpened, not on the thoughts themselves, but on how my mind insisted on clinging to every fragment of uncertainty, almost like gripping sand trying to hold a handful of fleeting moments. That realization don't dawn lightly. It felt like uncovering a hidden mechanism behind my reactions, an automatic device running even when I was oblivious. In the days that followed, I began paying close attention to the triggers that secretly orchestrated this rigid holding. It wasn't always intense emotions or obvious stressors, but often subtle environmental cues, a certain hushed tone in a voice during a phone call, the lingering echo of a critic's phrase from years ago, the way a text message remained unanswered past my waking hours. These triggers acted like invisible strings pulling my focus deeper into a quagmire of repeated worry. I pictured my mind as a loom weaving the intricate fabric of my experience, and these strings held patterns that I hadn't consciously chosen, but that dictated the texture of my daily mood and clarity. One afternoon, I met with Ellie, a mindfulness coach whose gentle presence invited me into new perspectives. What if instead of fighting those intrusive thoughts, we invited them to reveal what they're really guarding, she said softly. Her words launched me into an unexpected exploration of what lay beneath the churning surface, vulnerabilities, past pain, even hidden hopes I hadn't dared admit aloud. This approach didn't diminish my anxiety immediately, but it injected a layer of tenderness, allowing me to greet difficult feelings with less friction. I learned to listen to the stories my anxious mind told, not as threats, but as messages from parts of myself craving acknowledgement. During a particularly tense week, I found myself facing a flood of overwhelming doubts at the office. Instead of retreating inward, I decided to write a letter addressed to my anxiety, an unusual act that surprised me with its power. I began, "Dear Fear, I understand you are trying to protect me, but the way you shadow every step has become exhausting." This act of naming and addressing my internal pressure had a profound effect. It externalized the phenomenon, handing me back a sense of control. It was no longer an invisible adversary, but a recognizable presence with its own voice, which I could respond to with compassion or firmness as needed. A new rhythm started to emerge as I created quiet breaks throughout my days, moments not for productivity, but solely for reconnection with myself. I learned to tune into natural cycles, the rise and fall of my chest during breath, the slow unfolding of afternoon light through the window, the varied textures beneath my fingertips when holding a stone or leaf. These practices weren't remedies, but invitations to cultivate a sanctuary inside, one that allowed rest regardless of external chaos. Slowly, the grip of tension loosened, not because the worries vanished, but because my relationship to them transformed. One evening, over a cup of chamomile tea, I shared these discoveries with my sister Nora, who had faced her own battles with restlessness. "It's fascinating how often we try to escape discomfort," she said thoughtfully, "when maybe we need to invite it in as a teacher." Her words resonated deeply. Rather than pushing against unease and desperation, what if it had a valuable role, a guide illuminating shadows we typically avoid? This perspective didn't erase the difficulty, but expanded the range in which I was willing to dwell with my feelings, letting trust seep in where once only resistance lived. That same week, I encountered a challenge, a potentially confrontational conversation with my boss. Past experiences would have triggered spiraling anxiety for days, foreshadowing all the ways things could go wrong. But armed with new tools of mindfulness and intentional awareness, I approached the situation differently. Moments before entering her office, I pressed my palms lightly on my legs, grounding myself and whispering an affirmation silently. I can meet this with presence, not panic. Throughout the exchange, whenever nervous ripples surfaced, I balanced attention by noticing physical sensations, the coolness of the chair beneath me, the rhythm of my heartbeat settling. These threads of sensory experience anchored me in the present, preventing the mind from catastrophizing before the conversation even began. This shift did not produce a perfect emotional landscape, but I noticed a more spacious, flexible stance within. Previously rigid responses softened into curious openness, granting me agency to choose my focus rather than surrendering to automatic reactivity. My inner dialogue evolved, from a relentless critic reigning with intensity to a reflective observer adopting patience and grace. It felt as though a new chapter was opening, one where old scripts might be rewritten with deliberate intention. Now, contemplate the ways your own environment and subtle cues might be silently scripting your inner narratives. Imagine how cracking open space for gentle inquiry, creative response, and embodied presence might build bridges out of anxious repetition. This is not an overnight transformation, but an unfolding journey, where every mindful breath and deliberate gesture rewrites the story of your days, cultivating a resilient clarity that holds steady amidst uncertainty. As I continued navigating the labyrinth of my thoughts, a subtle transformation began to unfold, not as a drastic upheaval, but as a gentle realignment of my inner compass. It was as though the swirling currents that had once pulled me under started to reveal their shape, guiding me toward a place neither entirely calm nor chaotic, but holding a potent balance. The turbulence that once seemed endless gradually toned into a rhythmic cadence, where clarity emerged through the subtle interplay between tension and release. This shifting landscape invited me to engage with my own experience in a way that transcended reactive grasping, offering a vantage point from which awareness could deepen without undue struggle. In moments when anxiety loomed, I noticed a growing capacity to meet it with something akin to a guarded curiosity, an openness that did not demand instant solutions or resistance, but simply allowed the unrest to be present, like observing a flickering flame that both warns and illuminates. The dialogue inside me began to change its character. Urgent commands gave way to quieter inquiries, and the relentless chase softened into a practiced patience. It reminded me of walking through an ancient forest where the dense canopy filters sunlight in patches, illuminating some areas while others remain in shadow. Within this mosaic of light and darkness, life persists, not in spite of uncertainty, but encompassed by it. This nuanced encounter with my experience nurtured an unfolding dialogue between awareness and sensation, where the physical and the cognitive coalesced into a dynamic process. It was no longer about pushing away discomfort or desperately seeking reassurance, but engaging in a dance where each step created space for deeper understanding and subtle shifts. The body itself became an anchor in stormy seas, with breaths, postures, and touches offering entry points into steadiness when the mind risked spiraling. Such embodied moments provided evidence that transformation is woven through both our thoughts and our felt sense of presence, each influencing the other in an ongoing feedback loop. As I explored this intimate interplay, the boundary between observing and participating blurred, revealing an invitation to inhabit the full spectrum of what it means to be human, complex, restless, yet infinitely mutable. The mind's habitual narratives, once mistaken for unchangeable truths, revealed themselves as chapters in an evolving story, each subject to revision and reinterpretation. I sensed an emerging freedom in acknowledging that while discomfort may revisit like an old acquaintance, its visits need not define the trajectory of daily life. This recognition did not erase the shadows but imbued them with context, allowing their intensity to be felt without overwhelming the whole. During conversations with close companions, this evolving insight took on new dimensions. Sharing experiences that had once seemed isolating fostered an empathic connection threaded with vulnerability and mutual respect. I discovered the profound power that arises when anxious threads are voiced aloud, when silence gives way to spoken truth. In these moments, the internal landscape I had grappled with found echoes beyond myself, anchoring resilience in shared humanity. It was a reminder that the narrative I carry is never purely my own, but entwined with those who listen and walk alongside. With each passing day, the pace slowed, not externally, but within. Time gained new softness, allowing small victories and setbacks to coexist without urgency or judgment. The relentless urgency gave way to a tempered rhythm, a weaving of intentional awareness with acceptance. This quiet evolution sparked a deepening trust in the process itself, an assurance that progress is not linear, but spirals through moments of clarity and confusion alike. Like a river carving its path through rock, persistence coupled with patience reshapes even the most resistant terrain. Reflecting on this journey, I sense we are not simply contending with isolated obstacles, but participating in a profound redefinition of relationship, to thought, to feeling, to self. The gradual attunement to inner currents has opened a path toward greater harmony, not by erasing tension, but by embracing its place within the broader fabric of experience. This movement invites a readiness to engage fully, to listen deeply, and to respond with compassion to ourselves and through us, to the world we inhabit. Here, in this space of mindful presence, the possibility to write new stories unfolds, waiting for us to step forward with intention and courage. There came a quiet evening when, after years of wrestling with the relentless churn of my thoughts, I noticed a shift that wasn't announced with fanfare, but whispered gently, an invitation to meet my experience with a fresh gaze. I sat by an open window, the scent of rain mingling with the cool night air, and realized my mind was no longer a relentless barrage, but a landscape with valleys and peaks, shadows and light intertwined. That night, I no longer felt captive to the restless inner storm. Instead, an unspoken understanding took root. Anxiety, in all its intensity, is not a tyrant to be vanquished, but a messenger that asks for deeper attention, patience, and respect. I recall speaking to my dearest friend, someone who had watched me crumble and rise countless times, and sharing this awakening. It's like I'm learning to listen, I told her, not just to what my mind screams in panic, but to what it's trying to say. She nodded, her eyes reflecting a tender empathy, and responded, maybe healing doesn't come from silence, but from conversation, between our fear and our courage. Her words lingered with me, shifting how I envisioned the relationship I had with my own restlessness. It wasn't an enemy to defeat, but an energy to engage in dialogue with, revealing more about myself than I dared to confront before. As days passed, I noticed how the act of leaning into discomfort reshaped my connection to time itself. There was no longer urgency demanding resolution in an instant. Instead, I began savoring the journey, acknowledging that progress unfolds in waves, sometimes advancing palpably, at other times withdrawing softly, inviting reflection. Each breath I took became a rhythm that anchored me back into my body's wisdom, rescuing me from being swept completely by racing thoughts. I discovered, almost paradoxically, that presence created a sanctuary not by erasing difficulty, but by honoring its existence as part of my evolving narrative. One afternoon, while watching sunlight dance on the leaves of a maple tree, I recognized how essential it was to choose where to rest my attention, not as a duty imposed, but as a radical act of self-compassion. The awareness that I possessed the ability to cultivate tenderness toward my own inner fluctuations granted me a profound kind of freedom. Instead of being trapped in compulsive loops, I could begin to recognize the choreography of my mind. This revelation felt like stepping out of a dimly lit maze into a clearing illuminated by warm, unassuming light. In this newfound clarity, I embraced vulnerability unapologetically. I spoke aloud the truths I had silenced. It's okay to feel unsettled. It doesn't diminish my strength. Expressing acceptance did not weaken me. It shored up my resilience, weaving a thread of grace through the fabric of my being. I understood that transformation hardly happens in leaps, but through the accumulation of chosen responses, the trust built by consistent moments of kind attention and courageous honesty. I invite you now, if you follow this thread, to consider stepping into your internal landscape with a similarly tender awareness. What would it mean to greet your tension, not with frustration or resistance, but with an openness that invites discovery? What new dialogues might you initiate within yourself if you ceased battling the currents and began navigating them with mindful intention? This isn't about erasing the contours of anxiety, but learning to dance with their rhythm until they no longer dominate the music of your days. Our minds are powerful storytellers, often weaving narratives that feel carved in stone, yet are malleable when we dare to engage actively with their themes. By gently stepping off the well-worn path of repetitive worry, we can carve new roads towards steadiness and ease. This journey is not a race nor a destination, but a continuous unfolding, a daily reclaiming of our capacity to choose how we encounter our own inner world. Tonight, as you breathe in and out, anchored by the undeniable reality of your existence, remember that within you lies a wellspring of calm waiting patiently beneath the surface noise. With each intentional breath and thoughtful choice, you tend this source, nourishing resilience that glimmers even in the darkest hours. This is your story to write, not in haste or haste alone, but in grace, courage, and unwavering presence. And in embracing that, you transform not just your anxiety, but the very way you live, love, and become who you are truly meant to be.